1963, when Lester Pearson came to office, he was Canada's great friend of America. He was the man who had taken the U.S. side against Britain at Suez, and he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. It wasn't surprising that shortly after he took office, he went down to Hyannisport to meet with JFK. Lester Pearson was a great baseball buff, and he took part in a baseball trivia quiz. Kennedy was most pleased, and he said, "He'll do." At Hyannisport, Pearson accepted nuclear weapons. With this change in the climate, he thought the economic difficulties between the two nations could be easily taken care of. At his departure, Jack Kennedy gave him a personal gift of an American flag. Nine months later, a new president had taken Kennedy's place.
Lyndon Johnson would phone me. He phoned me about getting our troops to Cyprus under the UN, and I said not to worry. We knew our duty.
In Cyprus, hostilities had broken out between two NATO allies, Turkey and Greece. Someone had to stand between them to prevent a major rift in the Western alliance.
And they were on Cyprus, I think, within 24 hours before Parliament authorized their dispatch. He phoned me that same night again to tell me that he'd never forget this. He said you would never know what this has meant. And he then said, "Now, what can I do for you?" And I did nothing at the moment, Mr. President. But I had some credit in the bank.
Lester Pearson needed a happy banker. He had a serious cash flow problem. The balance of trade between the two nations was in deficit in America's favor to the tune of almost $6 billion over a 4-year period. A substantial part of this imbalance was due to imports of automobiles and parts from the United States. In the 1960s, Canadians were buying twice as many cars as they actually produced. It hadn't always been this way. The automobile industry had started out with Canadian companies like McLaughlin Buick. But these enterprises were bought out when the Big Three, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, discovered that by building cars in Canada, they gained access to the British Empire market. By the 1920s, Canada had become the second largest manufacturer of cars in the world. After the war, the British Empire market was gone. It was less of an advantage for the Big Three to manufacture in this country, making a whole line of cars for the small Canadian market. Pearson proposed dropping all duties and integrating the North American industry. In exchange, Canadian plants would be guaranteed a fair share of the continental market. LBJ's advisor, George Ball, urged Johnson to accept the proposal, suggesting that it would be the first step toward a logical integration of all the continent's industry. Lyndon Johnson invited the Prime Minister down to his ranch to sign the deal and have a taste of Texas hospitality. Only trouble was, the President couldn't remember his guest's name.
I'm delighted, Mr. Wilson, that you came early enough, and I hope you'll be able to go out and visit with us.
LBJ then invited Mr. Wilson to hop aboard and have a look at his spread. Still dressed in his three-piece suit that he arrived in, he was first taken on a helicopter tour of the Texas countryside, then across the ranch in a convoy of limousines, and finally cross-country in a Jeep with a couple of guns, one for the Prime Minister, one for the President, just in case they spotted some deer. Johnson kept throwing back bourbon after bourbon, pressing his friend Lester from little old Canada to do the same. Prime Minister Pearson remembered the state dinner at the ranch house that night as being an extremely informal affair. The ranch house was jammed with people, telephones were ringing everywhere, and state secrets were being discussed in front of everyone. President Johnson carried on a long conversation while his guests ate their meal of steak and catfish. Lester Pearson couldn't decide if the extremely informal way in which they were being received should be taken as a sign of friendship or an indication that they were being taken for granted. Pearson bedded down at the ranch house that night without having had a chance for a serious conversation about the auto pact or anything else of substance with the president. The meeting was only saved by a chance occurrence in the middle of the night. Paul Martin, Pearson's external affairs minister, crept downstairs to the refrigerator for a snack, and there he encountered LBJ in his pajamas making coffee. The two men discussed Canadian-American relations until the early hours of the morning. Shortly after breakfast, the press were bussed to the ranch to record the official story. Canada is the only country in the world with a large auto market that does not produce its own cars. Instead, under the Auto Pact, our industry produces for segments of the North American market. The Auto Pact is not an example of free trade. Written into it are safeguards that guarantee that at least a minimum level of production must take place in Canada. Under the Auto Pact, we design no cars in Canada, and our industry does little research and development. But we do assemble a lot of vehicles here, and in recent years, Canada's had a healthy surplus in its auto trade with the U.S. What Lester Pearson didn't anticipate is that one day assembly line jobs would disappear.
You know, it's easy to fall in love with these robots at the Chrysler plant. They're inexhaustible, although you might not want to take one of them out for dinner. There used to be 300 people working in this part of the plant. It was called the jungle. Now there are only 7 people working here. The problem for Canada under the Auto Pact is that we ended up with the assembly side of the industry. And that's where the jobs are being lost to robots. And we don't make robots in Canada.
American technological superiority was being used for another purpose. Bombing North Vietnam into peace talks. The public was horrified, and Lester Pearson went to Temple University in Pennsylvania and made a speech suggesting that LBJ stop the slaughter. Lyndon Johnson called the Prime Minister shortly after his Temple University speech and suggested he get down to Camp David as soon as possible. Johnson was outraged and greeted Pearson bellowing, "You peed on my carpet." Then later added, "And besides, you screwed me on the Auto Pact."
Well, I wasn't there, but I heard about it. Then he's supposed to have grabbed Pearson by the throat, lifted him off his feet, and started to choke him. You know, it was an unusual approach for the head of one state to greet another one.
Lester Pearson, ever the diplomat, ever anxious not to displease, wrote the president an apologetic letter a few days later, thanking him for your kindness, for your consideration in speaking to me so frankly. Much later, after Pearson had retired from active political life, I remember going to hear him speak at a meeting at the Chateau Laurier of the Canadian Radio Club. He was talking about his political experience and summing up his views on Canadian-American relations, and he said that those relations surprised him, that perhaps he had not understood just how difficult it is for Canada to survive on this continent.
Does anybody want my autograph?
Years before he became Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau had written that he thought Pearson had sold out on nuclear weapons, and that Kennedy had interfered to defeat Diefenbaker. With the new leader, the country had a Kennedy-like star of its own. Some voters thought Trudeau was a nationalist who would be tough with the Americans. But Trudeau was a pragmatist and went along with the view that the Americans were our best friends, whether we liked it or not.
He was very strongly opposed to Quebec nationalism. And the reason that he was opposed to Quebec nationalism was exactly the same reason why he was opposed to Canadian nationalism. He just said there's nothing to be gained by cutting ourselves off.
But Pierre Trudeau found out just where Canada stood in 1971, when Richard Nixon announced that he had a score to settle. He struck out at Japan, which he called America's biggest trading partner, and the other nations of the West. He claimed they were prospering at America's expense. Among other things, he imposed a 10% tax on all imports to the United States. Shortly after, Trudeau went down to set the record straight and tell Nixon that the province of Ontario alone did more business with the United States than did Japan, and that we were not the cause of America's problems. He told Nixon that his tax on imports would cost Canadians thousands of jobs. Nixon said there would be no special deal for Canada. Later, the president let it be recorded that he thought the Prime Minister was an asshole.
What we are really saying, very simply, is this.
A few months later, Nixon came to
We do
Ottawa.
not have a wall between us. While we do have this great unguarded boundary, this does not mean that we are the same.
He made
It does
clear
not
that the
mean
special
that we do not have
relationship was a thing of the
But
past.
it does mean that we have found a way to discuss our differences in a friendly way and without war.